Hi, my name is Amy Stromgren. My parents were Rima Desjardins of Wolf Lake Métis Settlement and Russell Joe of Buffalo Lake Métis Settlement. I am coming to you from the shared traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Kwantlen, Paitsi, Matsqui, and Semiahmoo people. I started working at LCS in 2016, teaching grade 5. And in 2019, I took on this new role as the Indigenous Learning Coordinator and moved into teaching grade 6 at the middle school. Since then, I've had the opportunity to work with Indigenous students and families across each campus. I've met with small groups of students to do cultural activities and stories. I have also supported teachers in their unit and lesson planning to incorporate First Peoples principles and to help them grow in their own understanding of Indigenous knowledge and ways of being. I am so encouraged by the many conversations that people are having around Indigenous education at LCS. I was born in Edmonton and I was adopted at the age of 3. I was raised by an immigrant British couple apart from my own culture and language. Growing up, I was never sure of my place. It was difficult for me to know where I belonged. As an adult, it became more and more important to me to explore where I came from, especially for my own children's sake. My own culture and heritage is something that I'm still exploring and learning about. The story and history of my own family and people is one of resilience. Over the past few years, it has become more apparent to me that Indigenous education has been focused on the history of colonization and the impact it has had on Indigenous people. National Truth and Reconciliation Day is a time for us to reflect and understand where we have come from as a nation. Reconciliation means to me that we are growing and learning towards healing. This learning takes place when we are willing to listen to the stories and put ourselves in uncomfortable situations in places that will help us grow and learn. This week, we are going to hear some stories about famous Indigenous peoples in Canada. And our focus is on celebrating Indigenous peoples and honoring their contributions to our society. Our vision of celebration and learning pairs well with our school theme passage for the year from Mark 12, verses 30 to 31. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. In your classes and homes this week, I hope you are able to take time to reflect on the question that God invites us to consider: who is my neighbor? His answer to us is clear. It's the people who are most difficult to love because it can be a disadvantage to us. And by asking the question of who is my neighbor, Jesus is inviting us to reflect on how God loves my neighbor, because God puts them in our lives so we can learn from them. So, how can I learn to love them as God does? In 1 Peter 4, verses 8 to 10, it adds an important description of what loving our neighbor might look like. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. This is our focus for Indigenous Education Week. When we celebrate the perseverance and resilience of others, we build deeper connections and relationships. This requires our commitment as a school to growing relationships with our neighbors in the community. We are reflecting on what it might look like for us as learners to participate in God's reconciliation in the world. This week, as we engage in some learning in our classes, I would like to highlight the importance of what we can learn from celebrating Indigenous peoples and their cultures. We learn more about how people persevere in the face of adversity. We learn that God works in our weakness. We learn that part of God's plan is a deeper healing and peace that only He can give us. And we learn that as we celebrate others, we share in their success. During this week, we will hear stories of culture, language, contributions, and success. It is my deep hope that we will open our hearts and minds to the stories we will hear. I pray that through these stories, we will grow in our understanding of Indigenous people and their knowledge. Let's be a community known for celebration and appreciation this year. So when we encounter people who may seem different from us, we will see Christ in them more clearly. Have a great week of learning.